Welcome back to the deep dive. So it's Friday, January 23rd, 2026, and, just looking at the calendar and then looking at the headlines, it feels like a heavy week.
It does. It's relentless.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've been following the news, your eyes are probably just glued to the Middle East. It's this constant churn of headlines, geopolitics, treaties being floated and then shot down. It's just a lot of noise.
It's incredibly overwhelming. And, the problem with that kind of news cycle is you get stuck in the weeds so easily. You get trapped in the, who launched what in the last 24 hours, and you completely lose the forest for the trees.
Exactly. And that is why today we are going to do something, well, completely different. We're going to zoom way, way out. Or maybe a better way to put it is we're going to dig way, way down. Because the stack of sources we have for today, and this is a fascinating stack, it argues that what we're seeing in 2026 isn't just a political conflict. They argue you can't even understand the headlines unless you understand a spiritual narrative that's been building for, 4,000 years?
That is the core premise. We're looking at what our sources are calling the covenant cycle. To do this, we're really unpacking Dr. Faisal Malick's book, Ishmael Returns, and then we're layering that with a really in-depth breakdown from a recent Kurt Landry podcast that dives into the same material.
Right. And so the mission for this deep dive is pretty specific. We want to try to strip away the politics for a second, just kind of put the UN resolutions and the border disputes on the shelf and look at the root system. We're going to talk about this concept of the father wound. We're going to distinguish between a people and a prison, which is a crucial distinction. And we're going to tackle this theological idea called the one new man.
It's a total reframe. It essentially shifts the entire lens from a political war over land to a family crisis over identity.
A family crisis. That phrase really sticks. So let's start right there. The core thesis here is that the tension we see is not really about borders. It's about fatherlessness. Now, I have to, play devil's advocate for a second. That sounds almost too simple, pinning all this complex geopolitics on daddy issues.
On the surface, sure, it sounds reductive. But the sources argue we're not just talking about one person's, bad childhood. We're dealing with story memory. This isn't just personal. It's a cultural trauma passed down through DNA, tradition, and narrative. It goes right back to Genesis.
Chapter 16 and 21.
The split between Abraham's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael.
Okay, so let's act like we don't know the Sunday school version, or maybe we know it, but we've never looked at it through this kind of psychological lens. What is the story memory for these two brothers?
Okay, well, let's look at Isaac first. What's the internal narrative that shapes his identity? He's the child of the promise. He's the one who inherits the covenant. His story memory, the thing that tells him who he is, says, I am chosen. I belong here. I have a future.
So he has security, he has the birthright, he has the father's acceptance totally locked in.
Exactly. Now, flip the coin. Look at Ishmael. What's the defining moment of his life in the text? He's, roughly 14 years old? And because of family tension, Sarah gets jealous. Abraham's conflicted Ishmael is cast out.
Right. Sent into the wilderness with his mother, Hagar.
Yeah, that's Genesis 21. It's a brutal scene. I mean, they run out of water. They're literally dying in the desert.
It's dramatic.
Incredibly traumatic. And the sources argue that this event incubates a very specific mindset. If you carry that narrative, I was sent away, I am the mistake, I am not the son, it doesn't just go away. It festers. And over 4,000 years, that personal rejection, it sort of calcifies into a cultural identity. Dr. Malick calls this the father wound.
So the argument is that you have an entire lineage of people who feel on a spiritual level that they're the unwanted son.
Precisely. And this is where the sources get into the spiritual psychology of it. They distinguish between two mindsets that come from this wound. You have the orphan spirit versus the sonship spirit.
Okay, break that down for us, because orphan spirit sounds like a metaphor, but the sources seem to treat it as a very, very literal driver of behavior.
It's both behavioral and spiritual. Think about it this way. The orphan spirit is driven by a lack of identity. If you don't feel like a son, you feel like a servant. And if you're a servant in a household, how do you get to stay?
You have to be useful. You have to earn your keep.
Exactly. You have to perform. If you stop working, you might get kicked out. So the orphan spirit operates on legalism. I must serve to stay. It creates a system where you are constantly trying to earn approval that you feel you don't naturally have. It's all fear-based. I'm only as good as my last act of service.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Now contrast that with the sonship spirit, or what the sources call a kingdom mindset. That mindset says, I'm loved, therefore I serve.
The motivation completely flips. You aren't working to get the Father's love. You're working because you already have it.
Yes. One is striving for approval. The other is operating from approval. And here's where the rubber meets the road. The sources argue that the religious systems dominating the region, specifically the structure of Islam, are essentially an institutionalized orphan spirit. It's built on the premise that you are a servant, a slave to God, but never a son.
Wow. That is a heavy diagnosis.
Right.
But it leads to what Kurt Landry calls a kingdom bombshell. Because in the West, we usually think the solution is just forgiveness, right? Oh, they just need to know their sins are forgiven.
Right. We treat it like a court case. You're not guilty anymore. And that's true. But the sources say it's completely incomplete. They argue Jesus came for something so much deeper than legal acquittal. He came to restore sonship.
So it's not just you're out of jail, it's you're back in the family.
Yes. He came to heal the father wound, to look at that Ishmael spirit, the rejected one, and say, you don't have to earn your seat at the table. You are a son. And that completely dismantles the engine of the conflict. If you're a son, you don't have to fight for your identity. You already have it.
It changes the goalpost from who is doctrinally right to who is healed spiritually. That's a massive shift.
It is. And that leads us right to the man himself, Ishmael. Because I think a lot of people, even people who know the Bible, miss the significance of his name. The sources make a huge point of this.
I definitely missed this until I read this stack. Let's get into the etymology. Ishmael. What are we looking at here?
In Hebrew, it's Yishma'el. And it literally translates to God hears.
God hears.
And catch the timing on this. Ishmael is the very first person in the entire scriptural narrative to be named by God before he was born.
Wait, hold on. Before Isaac. Before the major prophet.
Before anyone. This is Genesis 16. The angel of the Lord appears to Hagar. Remember who Hagar is? She's an Egyptian slave. She's pregnant. She's running away from abuse. She's in the wilderness. I mean, she has zero status in that world. And God intervenes and gives her the name for the child.
That seems to completely contradict the narrative that Ishmael was just a mistake, a plan B, because Abraham got impatient.
That is Dr. Malick's central point. You don't name a mistake before it happens. You name a blueprint. The argument is that God was stamping Ishmael with a destiny from the moment of conception. The name itself is a promise. I hear you.
So even though the human story is rejection, Abraham sends him away, the divine story is attention. I am listening.
Exactly. God heard the cry of an afflicted slave woman in the desert before the law of Moses or the Ten Commandments ever even existed. It shows God's heart was tuned to that lineage from the very beginning. And this brings up that wilderness analogy, which is so huge in this deep dive.
Right. The story in Genesis 21 where Hagar runs out of water.
It's the perfect visual for the spiritual reality. She puts the boy under a bush because she can't bear to watch him die of thirst. She goes a little ways off and just weeps. God hears the boy crying. And then God does something really interesting. He doesn't create water out of thin air. The text says God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water.
So the well was already there. She was just too blinded by grief and trauma to see it.
Exactly. She didn't have to dig. She just had to see. And the source material draws this massive prophetic parallel. They argue that the Muslim world, Ishmael's descendants, have been in a spiritual wilderness for 4,000 years. They are spiritually dehydrated.
And the argument is that the well they're looking for isn't a political solution, it's Jesus.
The living water. The claim is that we are living in a moment in history where God is doing for millions of people what he did for Hagar. He's opening their eyes to see the well that has been there all along.
That connects right back to the father wound, doesn't it? The thirst comes from not having a father. The water is the restoration of that relationship.
Precisely. It's not about changing religions, in a bureaucratic sense.
Yeah.
It's about quenching a 4,000-year-old thirst.
Okay, now we have to navigate a really critical distinction here because whenever you talk about this topic, it's so easy to slip into stereotypes or us versus them thinking. But the sources are very, very sharp on distinguishing between the people and the prison.
This is maybe the most important takeaway for anyone listening who wants to understand the human side of this. Dr. Malick separates the Muslim people from the system of Islam.
Okay, let's parse that out carefully. What do they mean by that?
The people, the men, the women, the children, they're made in God's image. They're loved. They are the Ishmael that God hears. They have a destiny. The sources are so clear. God loves Ishmael.
But the prison.
The sources describe the religious system itself as a prison or a legalistic canopy. They argue that the system is structurally designed to enforce that master-servant relationship we talked about earlier. It blocks the view of the father. It reinforces the orphan spirit.
So the system is the thing that says you must submit, you must run, you must fight. It traps the person in that cycle.
Right. So if you're looking at this from a Christian ministry perspective, your posture has to completely change. The sources give some, like, rules of engagement. First, you have to refuse fear-based hostility.
Which is hard, right? Because the headlines generate so much fear. You see violence, extremism, and the natural reaction is to just put up a wall.
Of course. But the argument is, if you look at a Muslim person and you feel fear or hate, you've lost the plot. You're hating the very person God is trying to heal. But on the flip side, and this is equally important, you have to refuse naive silence. Meaning you can't just pretend the spiritual bondage isn't real. You can't just say, oh, all roads lead to the same place if the system is actively preventing people from knowing the Father. You have to be clear-eyed about the prism.
I liked the key phrase they used. We don't war against people, we war against deception.
That's it. You are fighting for the prisoner against the prison. You're trying to break the lock, not hurt the inmate.
So if the prison breaks, what's the end goal? Is it just to make everyone look like, I don't know, Western evangelicals?
Yeah.
Because that seems culturally narrow.
No, and thank goodness for that. The theology here gets really rich. The goal is the one new man. This comes right out of Ephesians chapter 2.
He himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility.
Exactly. Paul is writing about Jews and Gentiles, but the principle applies here to Isaac and Ishmael. The goal isn't for Ishmael to become Isaac. The goal isn't for Arabs to become culturally Jewish or Western.
It's about both of them becoming something new.
A new humanity. Reconciled into one family through the cross. The sources warn against two major traps people fall into when they miss this whole one new man concept.
Yeah, let's hit those, because I think we see these played out in churches and political rallies all the time.
The first trap is replacement theology. This is the idea that the church has replaced Israel. The sources argue this just fuels the rivalry. If the church replaces Israel, then you're basically just repeating the Genesis conflicts, fighting over who's the real favorite son.
It's just sibling rivalry with a new coat of paint. And the second trap.
Hatred theology.
Yeah.
This is writing off entire nations, saying, oh, they're the enemies of God, they're lost causes, turn the parking lot into glass. The expert argues that this refuses the harvest. If you hate the field, you won't reap the crop.
That's a powerful image. If you hate the field, you won't reap the crop.
The result of the cross isn't a superiority complex. It's a dinner table. It's a place where Isaac and Ishmael can sit down together, not because they signed some peace treaty, but because they both found the same father.
Okay, so we've got the theology, we've got the history, but for the listener right now, maybe they have a Muslim neighbor or a coworker, or they're just watching the world and feel helpless. What's the practical application? The sources call this the ministry playbook.
Right. And step one is so counterintuitive for us in the West, because we love to be right. Step one is, listen, do not start with politics. Do not start with who does the land belong to.
But that seems like the elephant in the room. It's the first thing everyone wants to argue about.
It is, but it's a trap. It triggers the defensive walls instantly. If you start with land, you're arguing about inheritance. If you start with the father, you're talking about identity. So listen for the thirst. Listen for that father wound.
And when you do spook.
Testimony over debate. The sources emphasize that in Muslim culture, there's a high respect for spiritual power and lived experience. Theological arguments, they just hit a logical wall, but saying, I was empty and God met me, I was anxious and I found peace, that penetrates.
It's witnessing, not lawyering.
Perfectly put. And there's a supernatural component the sources are very clear on. They advise a specific prayer strategy. Pray for dreams, visions, and encounters.
We hear stories about this all the time, actually. People in closed countries having dreams of a man in white.
It is, statistically, the #1 way Muslims are coming to faith right now. It bypasses the intellectual arguments and all cultural gatekeepers. So the sources say, align your prayers with that reality. Cite Isaiah 65.1, ask God to reveal himself to those who aren't even asking.
And finally, there's the need for safe community.
This is critical.
Yeah.
If someone leaves that prison system, that high-control religious environment, they often lose everything. Their family disowns them, their community ostracizes them, sometimes their life is in danger. The church cannot be transactional here. We can't just count a convert and move on.
We have to be the new family.
We have to replace the community they lost with the community of love. If we don't offer a safe landing place, we're setting them up to fail.
That is a heavy challenge, but a beautiful one. Now, I want to pivot to the timing of all this, because we started this show by mentioning the date, January 23rd, 2026. The sources suggest this isn't just a random Friday in winter.
No, they view this through the lens of the Hebrew calendar. They argue that the Hebrew calendar gives us insight into God's kairos, timing his appointed seasons.
So where are we on that calendar right now?
We are in the month of Shvat.
Shvat. Okay, for those of us who don't have Hebrew calendar on the wall, what does that signify?
Shvat is known as the month of roots, trees, and hidden growth. In fact, coming up very soon, around February 1st and 2nd, is the holiday Tu B'Shvat, which is literally the New Year for trees.
The New Year for trees. I assume this isn't just about Arbor Day.
No, it's prophetic imagery. The theme is the sap is rising. In late winter, you don't see the fruit yet. You might not even see the leaves. The tree looks dead. But deep underground, the sap is beginning to move. Life is surging before it becomes visible.
So the sources argue that right now, in the Muslim world, we're in a Shvat moment.
Exactly. Hidden growth. The argument is that while the headlines show conflict, the winter underneath the surface, the sap is rising in the family tree of Abraham. There's a movement of faith happening that CNN isn't reporting yet.
That's a hopeful image. But looking ahead, we move from Shvat into the next month, Adar.
Adar is the month of joy and, crucially, reversal. It's associated with the festival of Purim, which in 2026 falls on March 3rd.
Purim is the story of Esther.
Yes. And think about that story. A decree of death was issued against God's people. It looked hopeless. But in a sudden turn of events, the decree was overturned, the enemy was exposed, and the day of death became a day of victory, a total reversal.
And here's where it gets really interesting for our listeners who like celestial events. On March 3, 2026, on Purim, there is a total lunar eclipse.
A total lunar eclipse on the day of reversal.
You know, usually I kind of roll my eyes at blood moon theories, but the sources really lean into this.
They view it as a teaching hook. In biblical cosmology, the moon often represents the reflection of light, or sometimes false light. They see this eclipse as a sign of exposure and shaking, a time when things that have been hidden in darkness are eclipsed and transformed.
And the connection to Ishmael.
The belief is that we're approaching a window where enemies of the cross, people we thought were unreachable, are going to be transformed into witnesses. Just like the Apostle Paul. He went from being a terrorist hunting Christians to the greatest apostle. That's the kind of Adar reversal the sources are pointing toward.
So practically speaking, the sources suggest we're in a window between planting in Shvat and broadcasting or harvesting in Adar.
Exactly. Right now, the call is to pray for the roots. Pray for that hidden sap. Because the reversal is coming. And it might look chaotic on the surface, but deep down, it's life.
That certainly changes how you look at a calendar. It gives you a sense of participating in something rather than just doom scrolling.
It moves you from a passive observer of news to an active participant in prayer.
So let's bring this all in for a landing. We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with the father wound, the idea that this conflict is rooted in a 4,000-year-old sense of rejection.
We talked about Ishmael's name, God hears, and the destiny hidden in that. The idea that he was never a mistake, but always a blueprint.
We distinguished between the people, who were called to love, and the prison, which were called to dismantle with truth and compassion. And we looked at the one new man, the ultimate reconciliation of the family.
And we wrapped it all in this specific moment in time, looking at the Hebrew months of Shvat and Adar as a season of hidden growth leading to a visible reversal. It's a journey from the wilderness to the well.
From the wilderness to the well. I love that. It's the story of Hagar, and it's the story of the world today.
It really is.
Before we let you go, I want to leave you with one final thought from the sources. It's based on that verse we mentioned, Isaiah 65:1. I was sought by those who did not ask for me. I was found by those who did not seek me.
It's such a provocative verse.
It really is. And I want you, the listener, to just consider this. What happens when the spiritual harvest comes from the place you least expect it? We spend so much time focusing on people inside the church or the people we think are close to faith. But what happens when the people you thought were furthest away, the ones you might even consider enemies, are actually the ones God is answering?
It forces us to ask, is our table big enough for the family God is bringing home?
That's the question. Is your table big enough?
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone.